Tisquantum, known to generations of American school children as Squanto, was a member of the Wampanoag people of New England. He grew up in Patuxet, a village on Cape Cod Bay. In 1614, he was kidnapped by Thomas Hunt, the captain of an English ship that visited the coast. The English did not yet have a permanent colony in New England, but their fishing and trading ships, and those of other European nations too, had been visiting the New England coast for nearly a century. Often the captains and sailors seized Native Americans and hauled them back to Europe as souvenirs or slaves. As you read in the introduction to this book, Tisquantum suffered this fate. In Britain, he learned to speak English, and finally, in 1619, he managed to make his way back to America on another English ship. When Tisquantum was kidnapped, Patuxet was a flourishing village. A stream that was filled with fish in the spring ran through it. People grew maize or corn on sandy hills and gathered nuts in a nearby forest of oak, chestnut, and hickory. Other villages like Patuxet dotted the coastline all the way to Maine. Many of the Europeans who saw the coast at that time reported that it was thickly populated. Modern historians think that New England was home to at least 100,000 Indians. As the ship carried Tisquantum home sailed along the coast, however, he must have thought he had stumbled into a nightmare. From Maine to Massachusetts, no smoke rose into the sky. The land was utterly empty. What had once been a line of busy communities was now a mass of tumble-down homes and untended fields. Scattered among the houses and fields were human skeletons, bleached white by the sun. The whole coast had become a cemetery. Patuxet had been hit hard. No one there remained alive. Tisquantum and his English companions marched inland, passing settlements that lay quiet and empty, full of the dead. Finally, they found some survivors in a shattered village, and Tisquantum learned what had happened. In 1616, a French ship was wrecked on Cape Cod, and the Indians took some of the sailors prisoner. The sailors carried a disease, though, and their Indian captors caught it. More Indians became ill, and still more. By 1619, the disease had killed 90% of the Native Americans of New England. Some modern researchers think this particular epidemic was a form of hepatitis, perhaps spread by contaminated food. Tisquantum had finally returned home, only to find that in just a few years, his family, his friends, his village, his entire social world had disappeared. Stunned, he returned with his English companions to their ship and sailed with them to Maine. Once he got there, however, Tisquantum realized he could not stay. He had to go back to Massachusetts. On his journey back, some surviving Wampanoag took him prisoner, probably because he was linked to the hated Europeans, kidnappers and bringers of disease. The Friendly Indian. Soon afterward, the English settlers called Pilgrims arrived to establish a colony at Plymouth Bay in Massachusetts. The Pilgrims found the land nearly empty of inhabitants. Desperate for food, they ransacked abandoned Indian houses for their stores of grain. Some Native Americans in the area were still alive, and the Pilgrims were able to communicate with them through Tisquantum. Tisquantum would go down in history as the friendly Indian who came to help the Pilgrims. In reality, he was sent to them by Massasoit, the Wampanoag leader. Massasoit mistrusted Tisquantum, but he didn't like or trust the Pilgrims either. He thought they might be useful allies against another neighboring Indian group, the Narragansett. However, the Narragansett hadn't been hit by the plague, and now they greatly outnumbered the Wampanoag. Massasoit wanted to get the Pilgrims on his side in case of trouble with the Narragansett. Once Massasoit had decided to make contact with the Pilgrims, he had no choice but to use Tisquantum, the only available translator. The Pilgrims' governor, Edward Winslow, who succeeded William Bradford as governor, wrote that one of the ways in which Tisquantum helped was by teaching the English settlers to plant corn. His method included burying fish alongside the maize seeds to fertilize the soil and produce a good harvest. This may not be a traditional farming tip, however. Researchers have found little evidence that Native Americans planted fish with their maize. Farmers in parts of Europe, however, had used fish as fertilizer for hundreds of years. During his travels in Europe, Tisquantum had stayed in places where people planted fish with their crops. He may have learned about fish fertilizer in Europe and then introduced it to the Pilgrims and to other Indians as well. Wherever the fish fertilizer idea came from, the Pilgrims were lucky to have Tisquantum's help. They were lucky in other ways too. They might not have survived that first hungry winter without the maize left behind by Indians who had died. In addition, they might not have been able to plant a lasting settlement on the coast if the Indians hadn't been removed by disease, a disease brought by earlier European visitors.